Genesis 39, we're looking at loyalty. We've spent a little bit of time. Last week, we kind of introduced the topic. We defined it as a consistent devotion to a person or cause that will not be shaken by adverse circumstances. Given that loyalty only exists sometimes, or given that loyalty that only exists sometimes is not genuine, Joseph is a great example of this, because we could look at other men of the Bible, and though we know Joseph wasn't perfect, he's a good example and a consistent one. David, we would say David was loyal to Jehovah, but he also had some times where he kind of dropped the ball morally and spiritually. Last week, we saw Joseph was loyal in the face of trial. We saw in Genesis 37 that he was taken. That was when they took him and threw him into the pit and then pulled him out and sold him into slavery. And we'll carry on with that. But his life, particularly at the beginning and up through the middle of it, was a long series of trials. His life seemed to, he started out good. He was the favored son of Jacob. But then he was sold into slavery, and then we'll see he goes up, and then he goes down, and then he goes further down before he goes all the way to the top. And I know you know the story of Joseph, but it's good review for us to know that though his life was a long series of trials, he maintained his focus on God through all of them. And he trusted that God, was ultimately working his perfect will. We know that especially at the end of his life, that when Joseph was met with his brothers, and his brothers came and they were worried, Joseph said to his brothers, he said, "You meant this to me for evil, but God meant it for good." Now, I asked last time, we don't have it recorded in Scripture, but do you suppose that occasionally in the midst of the trials that Joseph had weak moments and his faith and his confidence kind of shook a little bit? I would imagine so, because he was human. And all of us have those difficulties when you're in the midst. Even when you have your eyes focused on God, it's easy for us to kind of get shaky in our core if we're not careful. And so Joseph did maintain his integrity. He did maintain his loyalty through all of this. But he was a man who was subject to like passions as we are. And so definitely a good example for us. If it's true that faith that cannot be tested cannot be trusted, then Joseph has shown that his faith is trustworthy, because it was tested last week and it stood up, and we'll see yet again another test tonight. Look in Genesis 39, we're going to see that Joseph was loyal in temptation. Verse 1, it says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand." So Joseph goes from, again, he's the favored son in the home of one of the patriarchs, Jacob, and he goes into slavery. But he kind of makes a little bit of a comeback. He's still in slavery, but he's elevated in the house of a high-ranking official of the then leader of the world, the chief of Pharaoh's guard. And so he's in a pretty good position, you would think, and he's head over all things. And his master really gives him an awful lot of latitude with which to work in his house. But Joseph was being watched in the middle of this. Verse 7 says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph. And she said, 'Lie with me.'" Now, whenever I would go through this passage with children or with teenagers, when it says she cast her eyes, that means she pulled them out and threw them on him. No, she looked in his direction, and not once. She did it often. She had her eye on Joseph, and she was consistently waiting for an opportunity to make him fall. And she said to him, lie with me. She's propositioning him for immorality. She was persistent, we read in verse 10. And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her or to be with her. Good policy. Good policy. He wasn't trying to be close. He wasn't trying to see how close he could get to the line without stepping over. He sees the danger. The Bible tells us that a wise man foresees the evil and hides himself from it. And Joseph is a wise man. He foresees the evil. He sees, hey, she's trouble, Mrs. Potiphar. She's trouble, and so I'm not going to be in her orbit. I'm not going to be around her. I'm not going to be in the area with her. But she was a patient woman, as these type of women usually are. In verse 11, and it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. Okay? That's important. He goes into the house for a purpose. He's not surfing the web. He's not channel surfing. He's not in a bad place doing nothing. He goes in to do his business, what he was charged to do. And there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. I think it's significant that she waited to pounce until there was nobody else in the house. Satan was very definitely involved in this. It says in verse 11, none of the men of the house were within. So she's waited, she sets the trap, she waits till nobody else is there, so that it would be as easy as it could possibly be. And there were a lot of angles that could have worked in her favor. In this day and in this time, immorality in Egypt was commonplace. It was acceptable. It was even expected in some realms. And that has been the case in multiple cultures throughout history of men. There have been times and places where immorality, to have an affair, it's just common. Everybody's doing it. She could have said to Joseph, everybody's doing it. He could say, well, that may be, but I'm not doing it. I'm not involving myself in this. It doesn't matter if the neighbors are. It doesn't matter if it's acceptable in our culture. I'm not doing it. She could have said, Joseph, it's all right. My husband doesn't care. And Joseph understood his position. Again, loyalty. Loyalty has to be all the time. Okay? If Joseph would have fallen, then his story would be very similar to David's, wouldn't it? Where he was consistent and then he fell. And you think, oh. And when we look at the story of David, we look at him and think, well, it's really good up to then, and then you blew it. And after that, David's life really, it circles the drain for a while. It's really bad. But in this case, Joseph said, it doesn't matter if your husband doesn't care. I care, and the reason I care is because God cares. God says that I shouldn't do this. I know what God would have me to do. Joseph had set his price, and he'd already sold out. Somebody said that everything's for sale. And that's true, if you get right down to it. Everything about me is for sale. But the thing is that I've also been bought with a price. So a lot of what would have been for sale has already been sold. It's been bought. I don't belong to you. And Joseph had a good understanding of that. He had set his price. Look, I'm not for sale. I don't do this. Regardless of the situation, I don't do this. Sin is pleasurable. Hebrews 11:25 tells us this. If the Bible didn't say it, we would all be able to attest to the fact that sin is pleasurable for a season. And Satan knows what to place in your path to tempt you, because he's been watching. He knows what you usually fall for. He knows what makes you turn again. He knows what makes you worry, what makes you doubt. And Satan will handcraft a temptation to fit you. And it'll be convenient, it'll be pleasurable, and it will be, let me put it in big quotes, private. Okay, because we know from Joshua chapter 7, with the story of Achan, is sin really private? Not essentially. No, you might be the only one who's affected by it at first, but sin has a ripple effect, and the ripples affect everybody who is around us. The Bible says, beware lest any root of bitterness spring up among you, thereby many be defiled. Okay? Sin has that effect. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to sell out the blessing of God for? And if we put it in those terms, it's a whole lot more stark, isn't it? If we say, are you willing to sell out God for the moment of pleasure? For the respect of somebody who you really don't even care about? Or for the approval of a lost person who's walking past you? What are you willing to sell God out for? If we ask it like that, I hope that it makes us say, well, nothing. I'm not going to sell out God for anything. But that's not how it appears to us, is it? We think, what would you be willing to just kind of bend? What would you be willing to compromise on? What would you be willing to... I'm not asking you to break your standards or your principles. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to just adapt them a little bit. Right? And it sounds a whole lot nicer. It sounds a whole lot more politically correct when we just adapt to the culture around us. But we just saw in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, be not conformed to this world. What are you going to allow the world to press you into its mold? If Joseph would have fallen, if Joseph, when Potiphar's wife says, lie with me, if he'd have said, okay, Joseph would have been pressed into the mold of Egypt. And he'd be just like that Egyptian, and that Egyptian, and that Egyptian. And as I said, immorality, commonplace, even expected. And he would have just been another one. But Joseph wasn't. Joseph wasn't willing to sacrifice in this way. I believe that Joseph, like Daniel, had purposed in his heart that he wouldn't defile himself. Just like Daniel didn't have any control over being in Babylon. But he purposed in his heart beforehand that he wouldn't defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. And I believe that Joseph, another man, he doesn't have any control over the fact that he's in Egypt. He was brought here under someone else's will and against his own. But he had purposed ahead of time that he wasn't going to fall in this way. It says that he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. That is you ever heard that discretion is the better part of valor, right? And that's exactly, in this situation, Joseph doesn't need to stand there and resist temptation. The Bible says, in the New Testament, it says, flee youthful lusts and sins which war against the spirit. Joseph does exactly what he's supposed to. She says, lie with me. He says, nothing doing. I'm not even going to stay in the same house with you. And we know, obviously, he will pay a price for it. But he lost his job, but he kept his standing with the Lord. He maintained his loyalty in the midst of temptation. That should be able to be said of each and every one of us. Take a look at the next chapter, Genesis 40. In the interest of keeping it all with starting with T, I have that Joseph was loyal in trouble here in Genesis 40. When Mr. Potiphar got home, Mrs. Potiphar had a bunch of lies that she had cooked up against Joseph. She said that he had tried to rape her, and so she was all set. And Potiphar was the chief of Pharaoh's guard. So he was kind of lenient in that he didn't just put Joseph to death. Instead, he threw him into jail, where Joseph would be for the next quite a little while. Verse 20 tells us, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Even though this is the place where the king's prisoners were bound, it probably lacked the table and the meals and the niceties that our jails have today. Jails in that day were meant to be punishment. Joseph was put in charge of the prison. It seems like everywhere Joseph goes, he rises to the top. He's sold into slavery and he's running the house. He's put in jail. Now he's running the jail in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph. Why do you figure the Lord was still with Joseph after his time of temptation?
He stayed loyal.
Because he stayed loyal, right? If Joseph would have sold out, and then Potiphar found out that Joseph had defiled his wife, I'll bet Joseph would have ended up in jail as well. Only this time, the Lord wouldn't have been with him. Okay? At least not in the sense that he was here. And the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Verse 22. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. That which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So this jailer doesn't sound like he's winning any awards, does it? He puts everything into the hands of a prisoner, but obviously it's of the Lord that this happens this way. Joseph rises to the top. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14 tells us, But, and if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye. Be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. So according to 1 Peter 3:14, but, and if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye, what can we, if that is a promise from God, what can we assume about Joseph in prison?
Suffering.
He was suffering and he was happy. Why? Because he was, in fact, suffering for righteousness' sake. Now, I don't imagine that Joseph was desirous of being in prison. That's not what it means. It doesn't mean that we're happy. Well, I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be. I'm sure Joseph had lots of places he would rather be. But he's able to have joy in the midst of suffering because of the cause of suffering. Over the course of time, Pharaoh's butler and his baker are thrown into jail. While they're there, they have disturbing dreams. For sake of time and because of where we're going with this, we won't go into those dreams, but they're upset about them. And Joseph comes in and he says, tell me your dreams. And God has used me to interpret dreams in the past. Tell me your dreams. So they tell him his dreams, and he interprets them. For the butler is going to be released and restored to his former position by Pharaoh. The baker, probably excited about the news that the butler had just gotten, was in for a pretty powerful letdown when it was told him by Joseph that he would be taken and he would be executed. His body would be hung up and the birds would pick it clean. Both of these things happened. But Joseph, before the butler left, before Pharaoh swooped in and executed the baker and restored the butler, Joseph explained why he was there to the butler. And he asked that the butler remember him to Pharaoh when he returns. Genesis 40, look at verse 20. And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, and he hanged the chief butler as Joseph had interpreted it to him. Verse 23. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forget him. That's tough. Even given that if you're suffering for righteousness' sake, that you can have happiness in that, that's still rough. Because Joseph he's been unjustly imprisoned, really unjustly imprisoned. I know that when you go to jail, most of the people in there are not guilty. But in this case, Joseph is truly not guilty. And the butler goes back into the presence of Pharaoh and forgets all about him. And it would be real easy when this happens. Again, you remember last week we were talking about that he didn't forsake God as the trial just got progressively worse. In this case, the troubling news, Joseph is sitting there in the prison, and the baker and the butler go out, and he would have been sitting there marking time probably. Well, it was the first day back. Today was Pharaoh's birthday, I heard, and so the butler was probably busy. Maybe tomorrow. How long do you figure it took Joseph before he finally just said, he forgot all about me? It wouldn't have been that long, right? A week. At the end of a week, you're thinking, oh, maybe he's just been really, really busy. But eventually there would come that realization, no, I've been absolutely forsaken here. And he had been absolutely forsaken by everyone except God. And apparently Joseph was able to maintain that. Joseph was able to maintain his faithfulness. He was able to maintain his loyalty when the opportunity came for him to have release, and then it didn't pan out. Let me read you some of my least favorite verses in the Bible. You'll like this. They might be yours too. Psalm 27:14. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage. He will strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Psalm 37:34 says, wait on the Lord and keep his way, and he shall exalt thee to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, thou shalt see it. Proverbs 20, verse 22 says, say not thou, I will recompense evil, but wait on the Lord, and he shall save thee. What do you figure I don't like about these verses? Waiting. I don't like waiting. I'm an impatient person. You can ask my wife. I'm not a tremendously patient person. But Joseph waited on the Lord, and he did it a lot. This wasn't months. This wasn't even a year. This was years of his life that he waited, that he remained faithful, that he remained loyal. Waiting on God is one of the hardest and one of the most rewarding things that you will do in life. Truly. Truly. And not waiting on the Lord and running ahead of him and trying to work out your own will contrary to his will be one of the most dissatisfying and most painful experiences that you will have in your life. Waiting on the Lord's not fun when we're waiting, but it's worth the wait. Joseph knew that God hadn't given up on him, that he wasn't going to give up on God just because things were not going according to his plan. I've talked to people many times as they're going into a trial, and they say maybe it's a sickness, maybe it's a surgery that they have, and they say, well, I'm just trusting the Lord. God's going to do this. God's got this. And they go into their surgery, and something happens. And it doesn't go how it was supposed to. And the recovery gets lengthened by months. And they think, oh, well, I'm just going to keep trusting the Lord. And while that's happening, another problem compounds, and it ends up taking longer. And I've seen both sides of this. I've seen people who have trusted the Lord and said, you know what? God has a perfect way. God has a perfect plan, and I'm going to wait on him, and I'm going to trust that he knows what he's doing. And I've seen people weather the storm like that, and I've also seen people weather the storm poorly. And they sell out halfway through, and they say, you know what? I don't really feel like God's in control of this anymore. And my first instinct is to say, no. God is still in control. I can show you from his word that God is still in control. But it's when things get long. It's when trials get extended. It's when trouble persists that our loyalty is truly tested. Anybody can trust the Lord through having their teeth cleaned. Can you trust the Lord through a root canal? Why? Because one's short. It's not pleasant, but at least it's short. The other's long, painful, and drawn out and can take a long time to recover from. But maintaining loyalty in the midst of what we saw last week, in the midst of trial, he went through it really bad. He lost everything and was sold into another country. I know people who've had really bad days. I've never actually talked with somebody who was taken by their siblings and sold into slavery. Okay? So as bad a day as I'm having, not having that bad of a day. Okay? He was loyal in the midst of trial. He was loyal in the midst and in the face of temptation. Why? I believe because he had purposed in his heart beforehand. Joseph didn't make the decision about Potiphar's wife that day when she caught him by the coat. Joseph made the decision likely on his way down to Egypt. And if not on the way down, then very likely the first time he noticed Potiphar's wife looking at him, and he said, oh, there's going to be trouble here. I need to keep my guard up. And when she came at him, he said, absolutely not. It's interesting, if you go in the book of Genesis, and one day we'll just go straight through the book of Genesis, but one of Joseph's brothers' name was Judah. And Judah had it in the middle of the story of Joseph. There's the account of Judah and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, who he committed adultery with. And it's interesting that when Judah was offered the chance to sin, he did it. Just right away. He was all the way up to his neck in sin. Where Joseph was in the perfect setting where he could have gotten away with it. It was culturally acceptable. Nobody would have cared. And when sin came, he said, nope. I heard it. Somebody said it this way. When Judah was offered the temptation, he had his credit card out. He was ready to go. I don't need to. There doesn't even need to be a wait here. Ready to go. When Joseph had the opportunity to sin, he had already purposed in his heart, not going to do that. Maintained his loyalty. And then number 3, loyal in the midst of prolonged trouble. Not just short. Anybody can be loyal through a little bit. But when your trial, when your trouble, when your pain gets longer is when it gets much more difficult and when we see the reality. Yes?
When we start into these trials and temptations, I know my tendency is just not to say I'm trusting God, I know I am, but I don't know why it's nature just to be, to me it's just nature to be quiet, because if it doesn't come out the way I want, I don't have to explain it.
And
I mean, that's...
There can be wisdom in that, in not talking real big on the way into trials. That's certainly good. But there would be nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to trust the Lord through the midst of this. But it does apply in a good way. It can apply a little bit more pressure. Because why? Because, well, I already said I'm going to trust God through the midst of this. And I don't want to give up. So, yep, that's it. I think a lot of people would kind of go with you and say, I'm just going to be kind of quiet. And I'm going to wait. I'm going to trust the Lord and I'm going to wait on Him. But I think it's in Psalms, wait quietly on the Lord. There's nothing wrong with that. But I've also known, and you probably have too, you've known people who've gone through trials, and their testimony as they went through trials can be a tremendous blessing, even through the loss of health or the loss of a loved one or something like that.
This loyalty or faithfulness, how did he learn this? I mean, does it tell us early? I know he had dreams early on as a young man, but it doesn't appear that his brothers had this loyalty. So how would he come at that? I mean, was it God inspired, or?
I think Joseph did have a walk with God. We know, and we'll find out a little bit later, that when Pharaoh is describing Joseph, when Joseph finally makes it out of prison, and he's standing before Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, how can we find another man like this in whom the Spirit of the Lord is? So I think he had the Holy Spirit, again, not as an indwelling presence like we do now, but I think he did walk with God. I think Jacob, for all of his problems, and he had a host of them, I think Jacob walked with God by the time Joseph was taken. And I think Jacob would have shepherded his son's heart in the direction of Jehovah. After Jacob met with God on the way back home from Laban's, when he was on his way back to his father, I think God really got a hold of him, and I think that would have spilled over to his son as well. Any other thoughts or comments?
He wasn't very old during these times, was he?
No.
He started out at 17 there when he was in chapter 37. So I don't know how long this all took, but he wasn't very. No. He's a pretty young man.
He would have been very likely in his 20s.
Yeah.
When he was in prison. Yeah. I can't remember. I have laid it out before in timeline, but I don't have it in my notes here. But how old he was? Joseph was born in Haran, And so he would have been part of that trip back with his father, but he would have gotten to see an awful lot as a young man about what God had done for his family. But not a very old man to be going through what he's going through.